You'd be surprised how invisible a man can become when the world decides he's no longer useful. What happens when a city forgets its heroes and one officer tries to remove a man who's anything but forgotten? Stick around and let us know in the comments section below where you're watching from and what you would have done if you were in her shoes. They told Rachel Monroe the first few months as a city patrol officer would test her. They were right. But it wasn't the crime, the paperwork, or the city politics that wore her down. It was the moral gray zones, the moments where the law met something deeper. And this morning, the shift had only just begun. She walked with purpose, badge freshly polished, the light blue of her uniform stiff from starch. Her boots echoed across the stone entryway of City Hall, her eyes scanning, trained to notice what others overlooked. 2 months on the job, and she already knew who the regulars were. Activists with signs, city employees hurrying inside, and the occasional protester with a megaphone and a cause. But this man was new. He sat on the cold steps like he'd been placed there by some unseen hand, posture straight despite his worn coat and matted hair. A duffel bag rested beside him, military green, the kind she'd seen in recruitment ads growing up. He wasn't panhandling, wasn't talking to himself. He was just there. Rachel slowed, her hand drifting toward her radio. The department had been strict, no loiterers, especially not on city property. Homelessness was being addressed, as the mayor's latest press conference had put it. Still, something about him made her hesitate. She stepped closer. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move along. This is restricted property." He didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. Just looked up slowly, calmly, and met her eyes with the kind of clarity that shook her. "Understood," he said, "but do you know why I'm here?" Rachel frowned. His voice was low, measured, not slurred, not aggressive. "I'm not here to debate with you, sir. If you don't move, I'll have to issue a citation." He nodded, standing with quiet ease. Not the kind of shuffle or strain she was used to seeing in men who lived on the street. His movements were controlled, disciplined. "I've seen worse threats than a citation," he said gently. "Excuse me." "Nothing," he said. "Just talking to myself." Rachel's eyes narrowed. Her instincts were shouting now. Something wasn't right. The duffel bag, the posture, the eyes that had seen too much and revealed too little. "What's in the bag?" she asked. He paused. "Memories. You're not allowed to leave personal belongings unattended on government steps." "I didn't," he said, eyes twinkling. "I was sitting with them the whole time." Rachel exhaled slowly, switching on her radio. "Dispatch, I've got a 1027 outside City Hall, male, approximately 45 to 50, possible veteran, no visible ID." The voice crackled back. "Copy that. Back up en route. You want transport?" Rachel looked at the man again. He hadn't moved, only tilted his head slightly as though hearing an echo she couldn't. "Maybe," she said. "I'll see." She turned back to him. "Look, I'm trying to be fair here, but unless you've got a good reason for being here—" "I do." "Then let's hear it." The man studied her face for a long moment. "I'm here to talk to my brother." Rachel blinked. "Your brother?" He nodded. "Does he work here?" "Yeah." "Name?" "Thomas West." She froze. The name rang like a bell she hadn't expected. Thomas West, the mayor, the man whose photo hung in the precinct hallway, the man who had recently been re-elected on a platform of unity, justice, and a plan to end veteran homelessness. "You telling me you're the mayor's brother?" He nodded again. She stared at him, processing. His clothes were stained, hair graying and unkempt. His beard looked like it had been grown for function, not fashion. And yet, that calm, that stillness, it was familiar. She had seen it once on TV, when the mayor visited a VA hospital and spoke of his older brother who'd never come home after the war. Not in the way they expected. She took a slow step back. "What's your name?" she asked, softer now. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel West." Rachel's throat tightened. She'd heard the name before. In passing. Whispers among reporters who speculated why the mayor never talked about his family. Rumors said he had a brother, a war hero, one who vanished after returning from Afghanistan. A ghost, now standing in front of her. Before she could speak again, the door behind them creaked open. A tall man in a tailored suit stepped out, holding a phone to his ear. He stopped mid-stride, his gaze falling on Rachel first, and then on the man beside her. His face turned to stone. "Daniel," Mayor Thomas West's voice cracked just slightly. The man, Daniel, gave a small nod. "Hello, little brother." And in that moment everything around Rachel slowed. The politics, the orders, the badge on her chest. None of it could answer the question, forming like a storm inside her. How had a war hero, a brother of the city's most powerful man, ended up like this, unseen, unspoken of, and nearly arrested on his own brother's doorstep? And what the hell was she supposed to do now? For a long moment, no one moved. Officer Rachel Monroe, her pulse pounding in her ears, kept her hand just inches from her belt. She wasn't sure if it was for the radio, the cuffs, or some invisible line she wasn't sure she had the authority to cross. The mayor stood stiff in the doorway, one foot in City Hall, the other on the stone step where Daniel West, his brother, stood like a living contradiction. Clean speech, military posture, ragged clothes, eyes that seemed to remember too much and yet demand nothing. "Daniel's," Mayor Thomas West repeated, softer this time, though the disbelief in his voice still rang out like a wound. Daniel gave the faintest smile. "You look different in person than on TV. Taller, maybe. Or more tired." Rachel's fingers curled into her palm. She wasn't trained for this. No academy course covered accidentally detaining your city's missing war hero. The mayor stepped forward slowly, lowering his phone to his side. "Where have you been?" Daniel lifted a shoulder. Around, Thomas echoed. "Dan, it's been 15 years. And yet I found my way here." He looked past Thomas into the open door behind him, the hallway of polished marble and political ambition. "I figured it was time." "Why now?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He shifted the weight on his feet, his hands slipping into the deep pockets of his weathered coat. Rachel cleared her throat, instinct pulling her back into the protocol. "Mayor West, sir, I didn't know." "You were just doing your job," Daniel interrupted, turning to her. "Don't apologize. I've worn a badge. I know how hard it is to trust your gut when the rules scream louder." Rachel didn't respond, her lips tight, eyes darting between the two men. She recognized something in Daniel. An aura, maybe. That strange, unspoken presence some veterans carried. Not arrogance, not aggression, something quieter, like gravity. Thomas's jaw tensed. "Do you need something?" he asked. It came out sharper than intended. "I need to sit down." "I'm not talking about a chair." "I am," Daniel replied evenly. "We can go from there." Thomas hesitated. He glanced at Rachel, then at the open door, and finally stepped aside. Rachel didn't move, unsure if she was dismissed or included. But Daniel turned to her again, that same steady gaze pinning her gently. "You coming, officer?" It took her a second to answer. "Yes, sir." Inside, City Hall buzzed with quiet bureaucracy. Phones rang behind closed doors, shoes clicked across polished floors, and assistants whispered into earpieces. But as the mayor led Daniel and Rachel down a hallway to a smaller meeting room, the sound seemed to fade. The door clicked shut behind them. The room was modest, a far cry from the grand council chambers upstairs. A long wooden table, 6 chairs, a wall clock ticking quietly. Rachel remained standing near the door while Daniel took a seat, slowly unshouldering the duffel bag and placing it on the floor beside him. Thomas didn't sit. He stood behind the chair, opposite Daniel, hands resting on the back of it, gripping it like a man anchoring himself. "Thought you were dead," he said at last. Daniel nodded slowly. "A lot of people did. Mom died without knowing if you were alive." "I know." "Yeah, you could have come back. You should have." Daniel didn't flinch. "There's a lot of should-haves in war. Some get you killed, some keep you going. I chose the one that kept me breathing." Rachel looked away, suddenly feeling like she was trespassing in something sacred and raw. Family, guilt, history. None of it belonged to her, but she was here now, a witness. "I was 24, Thomas said. A staff aide, still sleeping on a friend's couch. And I got the call that your unit had been ambushed near Spin Boldak. No body, no survivors." Daniel's voice came gently. "That wasn't a lie. Most of us didn't. You let me think you were one of them." "No," Daniel said, eyes locking on his brother's. "I let you build your life without the weight of mine." Silence settled again. The clock ticked. "I came back 4 months later," Daniel continued. "But I wasn't whole, not in any way that mattered. The VA, the system, they gave me pills, forms, lines to stand in, but no answers. I couldn't breathe in a house, couldn't stand 4 walls, couldn't talk to anyone who hadn't heard the same screams. And so you disappeared? I walked, for a while. Then I lived off-grid. Worked in Arizona, disappeared in Colorado. Learned to fix diesel engines in Oregon. Slept under bridges, in barns, in church basements. I got used to being no one." "But you weren't," Thomas whispered. "You were someone. You were my brother." Daniel looked down at the table. "I came back this week," he said, "and I saw your face on a screen, talking about housing for veterans, talking about policy. And I thought, damn, Tommy did it. He made it." He looked up, eyes sharp with something like pride. "I had to see it for myself." Thomas's throat worked silently. "Why didn't you come home sooner?" "Because I didn't want to be a headline," Daniel replied. "Didn't want to be a story. I didn't know what kind of man you'd become, if you'd moved on, if seeing me would hurt you more than help you." Rachel watched the mayor's face change. Layers of politics stripped back to something raw and real. "You were my hero growing up," Thomas said, finally sitting down. "I memorized everything you ever said to me. I joined debate team because of how you used to argue with Dad over history. I joined ROTC because you used to shine your boots so carefully on Sunday nights." Daniel gave a dry laugh. "And then I went to war, and the letters stopped." "I didn't know what to say to a ghost," Thomas said, voice cracking. "I didn't know how to mourn you when they never gave me a flag." Rachel's chest ached with the weight in the room. 2 brothers separated not just by time and trauma, but by the silence between them, the kind that built walls taller than politics. Finally, Danielle leaned back. "I don't need much, not anymore. But I think I'm ready to stop running." "Then come home," Thomas said. "Let me help you. Let me do what I've been preaching about for the last 5 years. Let me show people what it looks like when the system works. I'm not a poster boy." "No," Thomas said quietly. "You're better." A long pause passed between them. Then Daniel reached down and opened the duffel. He pulled out a battered photo, creased and sun-bleached. 2 boys in a backyard, one in a plastic army helmet, the other in a cape made from a bath towel. Rachel couldn't help but smile. Thomas stared at it, then chuckled just once. "God, I forgot about that cape." Daniel slid the photo across the table. "I didn't." And for the first time in what felt like a century, both brothers smiled at the same memory. Rachel stepped back toward the door, letting them have the moment. Whatever came next, press, policy, public reaction, could wait. Right now it was just two brothers in a quiet room, finding their way back through the silence. 3 days passed, and the photo of the two brothers now sat in a simple wooden frame on the mayor's desk, half hidden beneath briefing notes and press packets, as if too personal to sit fully in the open. But the city had no time for quiet reconciliations. By Monday morning, word had started to spread. A photo, blurry, likely snapped from across the street, made it onto a local blog. Is the mayor harboring a homeless man at City Hall? The accompanying article was filled with speculation, half-truths, and an unmistakable edge of mockery. The mayor's press team scrambled. Rachel Monroe, still reeling from the surreal encounter, found herself pulled into interviews she hadn't trained for. Her commanding officer gave her a tight nod of approval behind closed doors, and a mountain of PR warnings in public. Daniel stayed quiet. He wasn't a man who courted attention. He slept in the spare room of the mayor's townhouse, ate breakfast before the rest of the house stirred, and only ventured outside when the sun had started to lower and the sidewalks emptied out. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was with a quiet certainty that made everyone else feel loud. Still, silence couldn't shield them. On the fourth morning, a crowd began forming outside City Hall. Protesters, reporters, passers-by drawn by curiosity. Some held signs of support. Respect veterans. End the stigma. Others were crueler. We elect leaders, not freeloaders. Nepotism is not policy. Inside, Mayor Thomas West stood in front of a mirror, straightening his tie with the same intensity a soldier might clean his weapon. "You don't have to do this," Daniel said behind him, calm as ever. "I do," Thomas replied, his hands still adjusting fabric. "No, you want to." Thomas turned. "Is that a problem?" Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Depends on who you're trying to prove something to. Them?" He gestured toward the window where muffled chants were beginning to rise. "Or yourself?" Thomas didn't answer. A knock at the door saved him from trying. It was Angela, his chief of staff. "They're ready for you." "And there's a new development." Rachel followed her in, already dressed in uniform, her brow tight with concern. A counter-protester threw a bottle. No one hurt, but the tension's building. Thomas nodded. "Has the department set up the perimeter?" "They have, but—" Rachel hesitated. "One of the guys at the barricade, Officer Hendricks, recognized Daniel. He said they served together in Kannar Province." Thomas glanced at his brother, a flicker of recognition passing between them. "Hendricks," Daniel said, his voice barely above a breath. "Slim guy, always carried extra batteries. Couldn't shoot worth a damn." Rachel nodded, lips tugging upward. That's the one." "Good man," Daniel muttered. "Would it be out of line to ask you to come with me?" Thomas said. "To the press briefing?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You want a homeless vet to be your backdrop?" "I want my brother standing next to me when I tell the truth." There was a long pause. Then Daniel gave a soft sigh and nodded. Outside, the city felt taut, like a cable stretched too far. The crowd had grown, fences erected between the opposing sides, and news vans lined the street like metal vultures. Police officers stood in full gear, not riot-ready, but clearly prepped for escalation. Rachel moved through the perimeter like she belonged there now, and in a way she did. The mayor stepped up to the podium on the temporary stage, cameras clicking like insects. He looked calm, measured, but those who knew him could see the tension in the lines around his mouth. Daniel stood to the side, not directly behind him, but close enough to make his presence undeniable. Thomas adjusted the mic, glanced at the prepared statement in front of him, and didn't read a word of it. 3 days ago, he began, a man sat quietly on the steps of City Hall. He was approached by one of our city's finest, Officer Rachel Monroe, for what appeared to be trespassing. What neither she nor anyone else knew at the time was that the man she encountered was my brother, Sergeant Daniel West. Gasps rippled across the crowd. Phones lifted higher. Camera lenses zoomed tighter. He was a decorated veteran of the United States Army. He served multiple tours overseas. He saved lives. He lost friends. And when he came home, the country he fought for didn't know how to receive him. Thomas paused. Let the silence speak. For 15 years, I didn't know if he was dead or alive. Then, last week, he walked back into my life and reminded me that all the policy in the world means nothing if we forget the people it's meant to serve. Rachel, watching from the edge of the police line, felt a swell of something hard to name. Pride, maybe. Or relief. Thomas continued. I have spent years standing at this podium promising solutions for homelessness and veteran reintegration. But those words were never supposed to be personal. Now they are. So here's the truth. My brother does not want fame. He does not want attention. He did not ask to be part of my campaign or my platform. He just wanted to sit on the steps of the building that claims to represent all of us. He looked straight into the cameras now. So I'm not asking for your forgiveness for bringing him inside. I'm asking you to look around at your city. Ask how many Daniels are out there. How many have no brothers in office to vouch for them? And what kind of leaders we are. What kind of people we are, if we ignore them. No one cheered. Not at first. The silence hung heavy until someone on the left side of the crowd, holding a sign that read, "My son was left behind too," began to clap. 1, 2, then others joined, tentative, then strong. The press conference ended not in chaos, but in clarity. But not everyone approved. Later that night, the backlash would pour in, social media would churn. One prominent columnist would call it emotional manipulation in place of actual policy. Another would accuse Thomas of leveraging trauma for re-election. But in the quiet that followed the applause, Daniel stood still, then stepped off the stage and walked toward the barricade. A few officers tensed, but Daniel ignored them. He walked to the man in uniform who stood watching him, lips parted like he'd seen a ghost. "Staff Sergeant Hendricks," Daniel said. "Holy hell," the officer murmured. "You're real." The two men embraced. Not as strangers, not even as soldiers, but as survivors. And in that one moment, no one asked for IDs, no one asked about politics. They just remembered. Rachel watched it unfold, arms crossed over her chest, breath caught behind her ribs. For the first time in days, no orders felt necessary. And for the first time in years, Daniel West didn't feel invisible. Daniel hadn't planned on staying long. He told himself that again as he sat quietly in the mayor's study, the low hum of evenings settling outside the windows. The room smelled faintly of old paper and cedar polish, with one wall dedicated to framed degrees and commendations. Another held shelves of books, some political theory, some poetry, and one tucked near the end that looked suspiciously like a military field manual. Thomas West was on the phone in the next room. He'd been pacing for 20 minutes. From Daniel's chair, he couldn't hear the words, just the tone. Firm, calculated, a politician's tone, not angry, not warm, controlled. It made Daniel restless. He reached down and opened the side pocket of his duffel, pulling out a battered notebook, pages curled with moisture. The handwriting inside slanted, tight, almost cryptic, as though even the words were trying to hide. He flipped past scrawled coordinates, memories of men long buried, nights without sleep, then stopped on a page with a list. Reasons not to return. He's better without you. You can't explain what broke. People forget. No one knows what to do with ghosts. You won't belong anymore. He'll ask questions you can't answer. Daniel stared at the list until it blurred, then gently closed the notebook. The door clicked behind him. He didn't turn. "You want a drink?" Thomas asked. Daniel gave a faint shrug, Not sure I remember what's worth toasting." Thomas crossed the room anyway and poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a glass. He held it out, waited. Daniel took it after a moment, cradling the glass like it might vanish. "This room hasn't changed," Daniel murmured, eyes on the bookshelves. "Used to sit in that corner and read everything out loud, just to hear yourself talk." Thomas smiled, briefly. "You used to listen. Had to, you'd never shut up." They both laughed, an unfamiliar sound between them, and for a moment the air eased. But it didn't last. Thomas sat across from him, setting his own drink on the table. "They're coming after me, you know." Daniel didn't ask who. He already knew. "The council," he said. "2 of them are pushing an emergency hearing, claiming I misused public property to house a private citizen. I wasn't asking for a bed." "I know. They don't care. They see blood." Daniel took a slow sip of the bourbon. It hit the back of his throat like fire, then settled low in his chest like something aching. "I'm not trying to ruin your career, Tommy." "You're not," Thomas said. "But you're the crack they think they can widen." He leaned forward, voice quiet. "One of them, a woman named Shaw, she already called for an ethics review, said I let a family member influence my office. Another's pushing for a full investigation into our vet housing program. They want to find dirt. Any dirt. Doesn't even have to be real." Daniel didn't flinch. "That what all this is to them? A headline war? Lawrence politics doesn't care who bleeds, only who gets the last word." Silence fell again. Daniel looked down at the drink in his hand. "You remember when I enlisted?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "Dad wouldn't talk to you for a week. Mom left the flag on my bed. You told me you were going to change the world," Thomas said. Daniel snorted. "I'd change something. Not sure what. Not sure it's better." Thomas leaned back, gaze drifting toward the ceiling. "You scared the hell out of me that day. You walked out with a duffel and a smile like you were heading to a summer job. And when the letters stopped, when the reports came in, I believed you were dead. I learned to live with that." "I know. No, Dan, I adjusted to the idea of you being gone. It shaped me. Every speech I gave, every bill I signed, every time I walked into a VA hospital or sat across from a Gold Star parent, you were there." Daniel set the glass down. "I didn't ask to be your martyr. I didn't want you to be," Thomas said, his voice sharp now. "But it happened. You became the reason I got up every morning and fought for something better. I wasn't just trying to fix the system. I was trying to redeem the part of me that couldn't bring you back." Daniel exhaled, slow. "So now what? You want me to disappear again so your story doesn't get messy?" Thomas looked at him, hard. "No. I want to know how to protect you without turning you into a campaign poster." "I don't need protecting," Daniel said. "I need a place to exist, without questions, without spin." Thomas's voice dropped. "That's not possible anymore." Rachel Monroe entered then, knocking once before stepping inside. Her expression was tight. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I just got off the phone with the precinct. There was an incident downtown. Another protest. They've started targeting veteran shelters." Thomas stood abruptly. "Anyone hurt?" "No injuries," Rachel replied, "but someone spray-painted faker soldiers on the walls of the Four Pines Outreach Center. It's not random. They're using your brother as an excuse." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Then pull me out of the narrative, issue a statement, say I'm unstable. Say I was never who I said I was." "No," Thomas said immediately. "That's not happening." Rachel stepped farther in. "We're being watched now. Every move you make, every step he takes, it's under a microscope. You need to decide if you're going to fight this head-on or retreat." Thomas turned to Daniel. "I'll fight, if you're willing to stand with me." Daniel's eyes searched his brother's. Not for bravado, Not for politics, for sincerity, for something untouched. I didn't come back for parades, he said. No. And I sure as hell didn't come back to be a symbol. I don't want a symbol, Thomas said. I want the truth, and if you're willing, I want the city to hear it from you. Daniel looked down at his hands. The calluses were still there, the scars, proof that he had survived things most people couldn't pronounce. He nodded, once. Then let's tell 'em, he said. Let's tell 'em what happens when the world forgets its soldiers, and let's see if anyone's still listening. Rachel straightened. I'll set up a presser. Daniel rose from the chair, his movement slower now, measured. As he stepped out into the hall, he paused beside the framed campaign photo of Thomas shaking hands with a group of Marines. He reached out, brushing dust from the corner of the glass, then walked away without a word. Thomas followed, the sound of their steps echoing in tandem. Two men who had walked different battlefields, now stepping into a war of perception, of memory, of truth. And this time, neither of them would be invisible. The stage wasn't large, just a platform of plywood and steel risers assembled on the courthouse steps. There were no grand banners, no campaign slogans plastered behind the podium, no patriotic music played over speakers. The only backdrop was the city itself, tall and gray and restless behind Daniel West, who stood quietly at the center, hands clasped before him like he was preparing to deliver a report in front of his old commanding officer. The crowd was thicker than anyone expected. Not just reporters this time, not just city officials or political allies. There were veterans, dozens of them, some in faded caps embroidered with battalion insignias, others wearing jackets weighted with patches and history. They didn't cheer, they didn't wave flags. They stood silent, shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the man they'd never met, but already understood. Daniel scanned them slowly before speaking. He didn't use notes. My name is Daniel West, he began, and for a long time, I didn't exist. He paused, let the words settle. I mean that literally. After my last tour ended, after we lost half our unit in Kandahar, I was medevaced stateside and discharged within 6 weeks. No ceremony, no guidance, just signatures and silence. I remember the nurse's voice as I signed my release forms. She said, "You're good to go." And that was it. That's the last time anyone looked me in the eye and said my name like it mattered. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I didn't come here to make anyone feel guilty. I'm not a politician. I don't speak in slogans. I speak in scars and stories. And what's left when you strip a man of the uniform that gave him purpose? Some of you saw the headlines this week. You saw my brother, your mayor, accused of favoritism because he let me sleep in City Hall for one night. A rustle of movement passed through the press cluster. Microphones leaned forward. Well, let me correct the record, Daniel said. That night wasn't charity, it was mercy. And it was 15 years overdue. He took a breath. Rachel Monroe stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching him like someone holding her breath underwater. For 15 years I lived between train yards, shelters, quiet farms, and colder sidewalks. I never panhandled, never asked for handouts. But I stayed invisible, because it was easier than being seen and misunderstood, and because in this country we don't like looking at broken things unless we can fix them. A woman in the front row wiped at her cheek. A man beside her, tall, thin, with a Marine's stillness, bowed his head. Daniel's voice softened. I'm not here because I want to be a symbol. I'm here because someone asked me a question I couldn't ignore. He looked toward Thomas, who stood just beyond the edge of the cameras, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. My brother asked me what I needed, and for the first time in years, I let myself answer honestly. Another pause. The air hung heavy. Needed to be seen, not fixed, just seen. He shifted his weight, the stage creaking beneath his boots. Do you know what happens when you spend enough time being ignored? You start to believe you deserve it. That your silence keeps other people comfortable, so you fold into yourself. You stop talking about the dreams, the flashbacks, the cold sweats. You stop calling home, and eventually home stops calling you. Behind the stage, the wind picked up. It blew gently across the flags on the courthouse lawn, setting them into soft motion. "I'm not the only one," Daniel said. "You walk past us every day, on benches, in alleys, sitting outside VA clinics with that same duffel bag you've seen in the movies, and we don't say anything because somewhere along the way we were taught that asking for help makes us weak, that our service ended when the uniform came off, that honor has an expiration date." A younger man near the barricade blinked hard, his Army Ranger tattoo peeked from beneath his sleeve. He nodded once. "I came back here not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. I needed to know if the city my brother served could handle hearing from the men and women who served it first." Daniel turned slightly, addressing the rows of reporters now. "So here I am, no medals, no uniform, just a man who gave 22 years to his country and got 15 years of silence in return. And I'm asking you, not as a story or a headline, but as a fellow citizen, what do you owe someone like me?" Silence, and then a single camera flash. Not a frenzy, just a moment, being documented, proof that something true was being said. Daniel stepped back from the mic, letting the words settle like dust on stone. No one clapped at first. Then someone at the edge of the veterans group raised 2 fingers in a quiet salute. Another followed, and another, until a wave of quiet salutes spread through the crowd. No cheers, no chants, just respect. Rachel stepped closer to the platform, catching Daniel's eye. He gave her a nod, subtle and respectful. Thomas finally moved, stepping up to the podium with a hand lightly brushing his brother's shoulder as they passed each other. He didn't try to follow that speech with one of his own. He just cleared his throat. "You heard him," he said. "Now let's get to work." Later that evening, the footage aired on every major local station and several national ones. The story had already been picked up by national papers by morning. The tone had changed. What had started as a scandal now felt more like a reckoning. The hashtag #SeenNotSaved began trending. Messages poured in, from veterans, from families, from city leaders across the country, asking how they could replicate what Thomas and Daniel had started. But inside the townhouse that night there were no celebrations, no champagne, just quiet. Daniel sat on the porch, alone, staring at the stars. His duffel bag was still by his side, untouched since the speech. Thomas joined him a few minutes later, handing over a second beer. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Thomas said, "You changed something today." Daniel shook his head. "I just reminded them it was broken." Thomas sipped his drink. "Still counts?" Another pause. The city glowed around them, muffled and vast. "You staying?" Thomas asked. Daniel thought for a moment, then leaned back in the chair. "For a while," he said, "until it feels like I belong again." "You always belong, Dan." Daniel looked over. Then why'd it take 15 years for anyone to say that out loud? Thomas didn't answer right away. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Because I think I needed to hear it from you first." Daniel smiled, just slightly. Infinite affirmative repetition, and for the first time in a long time he let it stay. The letter arrived a week later, hand-delivered by a courier who wore a pressed suit and didn't speak more than 2 words. Rachel Monroe had been in the precinct's break room when the call came in that something had been dropped off for her at the front desk. She hadn't expected to see a linen envelope, cream-colored, with her name scrawled in a tight but elegant hand. Inside was an invitation. No header. No logo. Just 12 words in black ink. "You were part of this. Please stand with us. D.W." Rachel folded it carefully and slipped it into the breast pocket of her uniform. She didn't need to ask what "this" was. She already knew. On a crisp Sunday morning, beneath a sky so clear it looked painted, the city gathered on the edge of Marston Avenue, where an old building had stood boarded up for years. Once it had been a VA satellite clinic. Then it had closed down from budget reallocations, according to the brass. For a long time it had been a shell. Forgotten. Now it was something new. Rachel parked just down the block and walked the rest of the way. The crowd was large but peaceful. There were folding chairs set up in rows, a small PA system, and rows of flagpoles bearing service emblems for every branch of the military. What stood in front of the clinic, though, was what made her stop cold. The building had been transformed, not just cleaned or painted. The brick had been carefully restored, the fencing replaced with a garden lined with native plants. The entrance now bore a new seal, the West Center for Veteran Reintegration, and beneath that, etched in bold, "Every soldier deserves a home that remembers." Rachel spotted Daniel standing near the entrance, dressed simply in jeans and a clean gray button-down. His beard had been trimmed, not shaved, and he stood straighter now, not with the rigid caution of a man on edge, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who belonged. A group of veterans stood beside him, some she recognized from the protest, others from the shelter downtown. A few held small plaques. She approached slowly. Daniel saw her and smiled. "Officer Monroe." "You're really doing this?" she said, looking at the building. "We're doing this," he corrected. "This wasn't mine alone." She gestured toward the crowd. "Looks like the whole city showed up." He nodded. "Some things are louder than scandal." Mayor Thomas West stepped up to the podium. This time there were no cameras swarming him, no controversy behind the eyes of the crowd, just community. "Thank you for being here," Thomas began. "This is not a ribbon cutting. This isn't about publicity. It's a promise." He glanced toward Daniel. "A promise that every man and woman who serves this country will not be forgotten the moment they come home. That housing isn't just shelter, it's dignity. That therapy isn't weakness, it's healing. And that the memories we carry, good and bad, deserve space in the cities we protect." He turned back to the crowd. "The center will offer transitional housing, trauma-informed counseling, workforce training, and legal advocacy for any veteran who walks through that door. No conditions, no quotas, no politics." A quiet cheer rose from the crowd, respectful but warm. Thomas stepped back and Daniel took his place. Tension. He didn't speak long. "I'm still learning how to be visible again," he said. "But if my story reminded this city what was broken, then maybe it was worth the silence that came before." Then he turned to the veterans beside him, holding the plaques. "These are the names of the men I served with. Some are here today, others aren't. But all of them carried something that changed them." The plaques were lifted, one by one, and gently set into the wall of the garden, a living memorial. Rachel felt her throat tighten, not because of the ceremony, but because she knew what this meant for others, for those who'd been forgotten too long. This wasn't a statue. It wasn't a flag on a pole. It was something living. After the crowd dispersed, she found Daniel sitting on the edge of the garden bed, talking with a young woman who'd just left the Navy. She was barely 24, and Rachel caught parts of the conversation as she walked up. Insomnia, panic attacks, being afraid to ask for help because it might cost her security clearance. Daniel just nodded. Not in pity, in recognition. Rachel waited until the woman thanked him and walked off. "She's gonna be okay," he said. "She has somewhere to go now," Rachel replied. "That changes everything." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the hum of conversation behind them as people lingered, walked the garden, or stood by the name plaques. "You know," Rachel said, "I had a cousin. Iraq. He made it back, but he never really came back. Slept in his car for 2 years before anyone even noticed. Daniel nodded. That's more common than you think. He wished someone had stopped him the way I stopped you. He looked over. You didn't stop me, Rachel. You saw me. She blinked. He'd never used her first name before, and it struck her that this center, this morning, this moment, wasn't just about building something for others. It was about Daniel finally reclaiming something for himself. Later that afternoon, when the crowd had thinned and the sun dipped lower, Rachel walked back to her patrol car. Before she left, she looked back at the West Center one last time. She saw a man standing at the top of the steps, hands behind his back, eyes scanning the horizon like a sentry on duty. Not invisible, not forgotten, just home, and the city, for the first time in a long time, had remembered what honor really looked like.